video is Unit 3 on the cell, Learning Targets 1, Cell Theory. First things first with cells is something we've talked about before. Cells are the basic unit of all of life for all living things. A cell is considered living by itself, whereas things that are smaller than cells, like the parts of cells, are not considered living in and of themselves. A scientist by the name of Robert Hooke was the first to observe cells. He observed cells in a cork tree, and he coined the term cell because he said they look like little cells, little rooms. You can see here he did it with dead cells, and so they're all kind of hollow, so they look like these little rooms, and that's what he called them, cells. And so Robert Hooke was the one who coined the term cell. And then one after him, called Anton Van Leeuwen, he was the first to see living cells. He observed one-celled organisms like protozoa, and he also observed human red blood cells. There's a picture of Von Leeuwenhoek. No, I would say it's more of a drawing than a picture. And here's some of the stuff that he saw. We'll do a lab in this class where we'll look at some pond water samples, and we'll be able to see some of the fun things that Mr. Von Leeuwenhoek saw. At least hopefully we will. And later, a man by the name of Matthias Schleiden claimed that all plants were composed of cells. And so up until this time, scientists weren't really sure what plants are made of. And so he's putting all the facts together. Hooke has seen these cells, and Von Leeuwenhoek has seen living cells. And so Schleiden has saw cells in many types of plants. I have a picture of the Elodia leaf. Elodia is the leaves that are in like a fish aquarium. And you can see the cells, and you can see the parts of the cells really well in an Elodia leaf. And so Matthias Schleiden said all plants are composed of cells. Well, another man, Theodor Schwann, came up with the same conclusion concerning animal cells, that all animals are composed of cells. It's easy to remember because, a swan is an animal, even though that's not a particularly good swan. A swan is an animal, and so it's easy to remember that Theodor Schwann came up with the idea that all animals are composed of cells as well. And this man, Rudolf Virchow, claimed that all cells come from pre-existing cells. And so at this point in a history of science, they had already established that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation, meaning that life doesn't just spontaneously come about. And Virchow said, well, cells then must come from pre-existing cells. And so the work of all of these men is put together in what is called the cell theory. The cell theory is made up of these three facts: that all things are composed of cells. All living things are composed of cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things, meaning that they are the basic unit of life. There's nothing more basic than a cell in a living thing that is alive. And that new cells are produced from pre-existing cells. So those three pieces of the cell theory explain, because it's theory, right? Explain living things and their composition being cells. Now, the cell theory is the kind of the surface of this system. And as we get deeper into talking about cells, we'll see that this is actually a very deep deep rabbit hole. So there are a few characteristics that all cells share. All cells share three basic characteristics, all the way back from bacteria to the most complex eukaryotic cell. All share three shared characteristics, which points to a shared ancestry. And these three characteristics are: all cells are composed of a plasma membrane. Plasma membrane. Sometimes you'll see this called the cell membrane. And this is a protective membrane that surrounds the cell, protects the cell, and it regulates materials in and out of the cell. This bacterial cell here has a plasma membrane. It also has a cell wall surrounding it, but it has a plasma membrane. All cells have a plasma membrane. The second thing that all cells have is cytoplasm. And cytoplasm is all the material inside the cell that's not inside the nucleus. Cytoplasm, all the material inside the cell that is not in the nucleus. This includes a gel-like substance called cytosol, as well as the organelles. Some cells only have a few organelles in their cytoplasm, like this bacteria cell. It's just like ribosomes and a few other things. It's not very complicated, whereas some cells are extremely complex. And the last thing that all cells have and all cells share is genetic material. All living things contain DNA. Now notice, I did not say that all living things have a nucleus, because that's not true. Check out this bacteria cell. It does not have a nucleus, but it does have DNA. All living things have genetic material. This is the instructions for how the cell is to operate. So with that, we're going to look at two main categories for cells. The first category is prokaryotic cell. Now, the word prokaryotic tells us a lot about these types of cells. Pro means before. Pro means before, and the word karyos means nucleus. And so prokaryotic cells are before nucleus, meaning that they were the first forms of life. Prokaryotic cells were the first types of cells. They evolved before the evolution of the nucleus. So eukaryotic cells come after those. Prokaryotic cells are very simple. A few characteristics they have no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. The only kinds of organelles that they have do not have a membrane surrounding them, like ribosomes do not have a membrane. They have a single circular chromosome that contains their DNA. And again, much smaller, much less complex. Now that doesn't mean that they're not complex, because they are incredibly complex, but compared to a eukaryotic cell, they're not very complex. And examples of prokaryotic cells, almost all the time, can't even think of another one actually, we will be talking about bacteria when we talk about prokaryotic cells. Here's a picture of some bacteria. This is actually a picture of the MRSA bacteria, which is a type of staph bacteria, very dangerous, hangs out in locker rooms. Eukaryotic cells, supposed to look at the word eukaryotic. The prefix edu means true, and then of course karyos means nucleus. So these cells evolved after prokaryotes because they have a nucleus in the center of the cell, and the nucleus is surrounded by a membrane. So some characteristics of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, and this nucleus contains the DNA. The DNA inside of a eukaryotic cell is contained, protected inside the nucleus. Eukaryotic cells have many specialized organelles. You can see here, many specialized organelles. ER and the lysosome and uh, Golgi body, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, centrioles, lots of different things. Um, Eukaryotic cells have multiple linear chromosomes. So meaning, whereas the bacteria had this single circular chromosome, eukaryotic cells have multiple linear chromosomes. They're not circular, they are linear. And eukaryotic cells vary in size and complexity. You have everything from really small cells like a sperm cell to really large cells like a human egg cell. Here's a picture of some red blood cells. They have a very specific function. They carry oxygen. That is their function. So with eukaryotic cells, you also have cell specialization, which involves different kinds of cells doing different kinds of things. Now, with eukaryotic cells, there is a theory concerning them called the endosymbiosis theory. And if you look at the word endosymbiosis, endo means inside, sym means together, and bio means living. So this is the idea, this is a theory as to how eukaryotic cells evolved from prokaryotic cells. And so the idea, and we'll go into more detail with this, but the idea is that here's a eukaryotic cell, and at one point it decided to eat a smaller eukaryotic cell. Well, that smaller eukaryotic cell, or smaller prokaryotic cell, these are prokaryotic cells, sorry, that smaller prokaryotic cell happened to be able to use oxygen to get energy. Well, instead of devouring it, this new prokaryotic cell actually lived inside the bigger one, and they lived together. And so the idea is that eventually this became the eukaryotic cell's mitochondria. Well, and it makes sense because mitochondria have their own DNA. They have their own ribosomes, just like a prokaryotic cell would have. And they also have a double membrane, which we'll talk about later. Well, the same thing could be true if the plant ate a little cell, or if the prokaryotic cell ate a little cell that happened to be able to make its own food using sunlight. Well, that cell would then eat that structure and now is able to make its own food using sunlight, and that would eventually evolve into a being that is able to, or its own little cell that's able to make its own food and use oxygen to produce energy, and this would be the precursor of the first plants. And so this is the endosymbiosis theory, the theory as to how eukaryotic cells came from prokaryotic cells. Lastly, I want to mention the differences between animal and plant cells before we talk about the parts. We haven't talked about these parts, so I'm going to mention them. Animal cells have a few unique characteristics. First of all, one of those unique characteristics is that animal cells have centrioles. Centrioles are used in cell division, and because of the cell wall in plants, they really wouldn't have much of a function. Animal cells also have what's called cilia and flagella. And you can see this particular cell is covered with cilia, which are these little hair-like structures that allow the plant or the animal cell to move. Some cells have, here's like a sperm cell, has this long tail, and that's called a flagella. And it basically allows that cell to move. Plant cells don't move, so they don't need the movement. And then animal cells also have lysosomes. whereas plant cells do not. There has been some recent study to suggest that some plant cells do have lysosomes. We're going to stick with this plane for now. Some of the distinctives of plant cells are that plant cells have cell walls. Plant cells have a large central vacuole. It's like a little lake there in the middle of the plant cell. And plant cells also have chloroplasts, which are the organelles that use sunlight to produce food. Now, here's just a quick overview of that, and I would add lysosomes to this. Now, one thing I want to make clear, and that is very important for you to understand, is that just because plant cells have chloroplasts and animal cells don't, doesn't mean now that animal cells have mitochondria and plant cells don't. So do not tell me, and please make sure you remember, don't tell me in the future that plant cells do not have mitochondria. Plant cells have both mitochondria and chloroplasts, whereas animal cells only have mitochondria. They do not have chloroplasts.